Welcome to the channel. Today we will be looking at some deck templating you can do to create easy, fast Dimir builds. Now, if you've watched my previous video, you would have seen some tips I gave for the Is It color pairing, so blue and red, but today I'm shifting to blue and black. I'll probably go through them all eventually, just due to, I think, how popular the previous one was, and I think it was quite fun to do something like this to help someone like yourself who might be struggling to build an effective blue-black deck. So what exactly does a blue-black deck want to do? Well, there's a lot of different directions, and upon thinking about it, it's quite difficult to pin it down. It's a bit harder than Is It, because it seems to go in a lot more directions, and we'll go through some of the archetypes you'll see at different levels of mana. So I thought I'd start with something a bit more typical, which someone might associate with Dimir, which is the more heavy-ended Dimir control build. And Toxtrol is a very powerful indicator of where you want to be putting your mana and time and effort when you're playing a Dimir build, because Dimir can be a bit slow if you want to play it that way, but the payoffs are just incredible. Toxtrol is pretty insane against creature decks. It's so incredibly oppressive because of beginning of each end step, you put a slime counter on each creature you don't control. In 4-player, this is wild because it's going to trigger 4 times before it gets back to you. In 1v1, it's still strong because it triggers in your turn and theirs. And creatures you don't control get -1/-1 for each slime counter on them, so it only affects your opponents as well. And then when creatures your opponents die, you get a slug. You can sack slugs to draw cards. That's like the cherry on the top. Doesn't even matter about the last 2 sentences, really. But yeah, so with Dimir, you're going to want to play a bit of a stall game. You can't always guarantee that you are going to survive, depending on how much defenses you have in the beginning. You can see the curve here is still pretty heavy, like there's a lot of late drops, but most of the support is still in the early end because you need to defend yourself against the early game. If you're investing everything in your control deck at the 5, 6, 7 mana end, you're just going to die before you can resolve your big creature drop, your big planeswalker drop. And that's something I think I see a lot in newer players. When I used to teach people how to play in Paper Commander, I would just look through their deck and you'd see that they had so many high-end drops, 6, 7 drops, and I would tell them all the time to take 5, 10 of them out and just put more lands in. There's something to be said about having 40 at least lands in your decks. This goes across every archetype, by the way. It's just a blanket I've gone across in Arena at the very least, because Arena seems to be very tight with lands. Having 40 really does secure. I know people are greedy, they go to 30, 33, 35, but it just really doesn't cut it when you're trying to hit a land drop every turn, and that's something that Control needs to do. The importance of land cannot be you basically just, if you don't hit your lands every turn, you're not going to get to play Magic, and if you can't play Magic, you're going to lose the game. So in addition to the 40 lands, you want to have quite a bit of ramp. In this template, we've got Signet, Cold Steel Heart, Guardian Idol, and Mindstone. These are the cheapest ones you can really do consistently for 2 mana, which gives you +1 mana. We also have Dark Ritual, which is a little bit of a anomaly because it's so potent. 1 mana for 3 is kind of crazy. You can use this to boost out a really powerful spell early. I would advise not using it too early, though, unless you are using it for something that will pretty much dominate the game. Sounds really harsh, but if you go turn 1 Dark Ritual into Liliana the Veil or Black Market Connections, you're probably going to get a fantastic start there, and the game will probably end there and then, which is something that it's a bit ironic. You don't really want to have a game do that, because the whole reason you're playing Magic is to play Magic, right? So I do feel like Dark Ritual is not a very healthy card to be using in the game right now, just because it can just create a pretty toxic, feel bad environment, which is not something that I really want to be doing to people or be done to me. Luckily, it's not too common, but its existence is a bit egregious, a bit concerning, because it just sets a precedent for what else could be delivered into the game system. And let's just hope there's not too many more fast mana cards like this, because it is a dangerous card. As I say, turn 1 into Liliana the Veil is just absolutely brutal. But that leads on to the next component, Planeswalkers. If you're using a control style build, you will be needing Planeswalkers for a few reasons. Number one, if you don't have any win cons, a Planeswalker's ultimate normally acts like this, and this is in lieu of having creatures that you push out and attack your opponent's life total. So they are a necessary evil. I know a lot of people don't like Planeswalkers, using them or facing them, but they are part of the fabric of the game. And if you don't use it, then you're just going to be behind. So Liliana Vale is a really great example here. She's an all-star card across all formats that she's impacted. Her ultimate, you can see, -6, separate all permanents, target player controls in 2 piles. They choose one to keep. Brutal. Basically slices their permanent in half. Unlikely they can come back from this, but yeah, that's going to be really good. Kaito as well. His ultimate, -7. Whenever a creature you control deals damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. So by itself, it doesn't seem too good, because you might be asking, well, where are the creatures coming from? Well, he does make 1/1s as well that are also unblockable, and the whole deal with Dimir control decks is you're going to want a very expensive finisher creature, something like Jingataxius, which just comes in and literally warps the game. Hullbreaker Horror. You know, if you're cheating them out with Kaito Shizuki's ultimate, it's going to be very tough for your opponent to win. So you want to include as many Planeswalkers as possible that fit the goal of your deck. Tasha's also really good. What else do we have? Liliana, just disposing cards each side can be very strong. You will lose cards as well, but then you can kill your opponent's creatures with the minus ability here. So yeah, the more attrition you're getting, the more value you're getting and depriving your opponent of. That is what control is. Control is evil, really, but it does take a good player. Like, people do like to say they hate control a lot, but I think you should always face a control deck just to see how they win or how they lose, because a good player is hard to come by, to be honest. And that's why I kind of want to make these videos, because it doesn't just make... You could argue that why would I want to make people better players? Well, it just makes the whole game better. If everyone's playing better, there's less time thinking in the long run, because you're studying all these different avenues of learning. Like, you're watching this video, you're experimenting with new cards. So yeah, control is a bit of a weird one. It's a bit of a controversial archetype. I know people just don't like it, but I think the thing I've heard a lot is when you use control, people tend to like it. They realize it's a very powerful archetype, but yeah, it's probably the hardest one to really master, because it takes a lot of degrees of patience. Now, I'm not one person to use too many counterspells. I only have a few, like Counterspell itself, Pact of Negation, to protect your big creature drops. But yeah, some people, I completely understand, they make it more control, more countery control decks, which is not my style, but there you go, it's just part of the game. So if you come across people who continuously just want to counter your spells, that's where the bad experience comes from. But that is a viable option. I wouldn't say, though, that counter strategies are actually that good. I think it creates a bad feeling, but they are bad because you'll find that most people just seem to counter the first spell they see. I think there's a lot more power in being more selective in what you let resolve and what you let hit the battlefield. You don't have to counter everything, and that's why I think 1 or 2 counter spells is fine, because you can just protect your key assets. There's no point countering their 1/1 they've just played, because in 3 or 4 turns when they're playing their real heavy hitters and you don't have a counter spell, you're not going to be able to stop it. So just keep that in mind if you do want to use a more counter spell tribally build. Don't counter everything. And also, here's an interesting psychological test you can do. If you just go to full control in the game, which is by pressing the control button, you put your game state into a state in which it asks you when you want to pass priority onto your opponent and the next phases. Well, if you do that, your opponent will be informed of this, and there'll be a pause every time you are asked to pass priority back to them, and so on. The game also does this when you are able to respond with a card. So you can essentially feign having a counterspell. There's something very unique to digital gaming. In paper, you can do this by hesitating, going, I don't know, okay, I'll let it resolve, even if you don't have a counterspell. So it's one of those weird counterplays that makes Magic very interesting and unique. And unlike a lot of card games out there, you know, counterspell system is just wonderful. I think Yu-Gi-Oh has a similar system in trap card design where you do something and the opponent flips a trap card to stop something you're doing. But what makes Magic interesting is all the counterspells really are normally in your hand, so they're going in completely blind, and as long as you have mana up, it could be anything. So there's a few interesting things there for big control. So 7 mana creatures, planeswalkers, finishing your opponent off. Build up to these using mana rocks. Not just mana rocks that give +1 mana. You want to go for stuff that gives +2 mana, like 1 Power Stone. Key to the Archive and Firewind Vessel. These are important to give +2 mana. The reason you want stuff that gives +2 mana essentially is when Toxrill dies, it's going to cost 9 mana. So you want to be able to future-proof your future castings by having enough mana available to do so. So be cautious that if you lose your Toxrill, it's going to take a bit of resource and time to get it back. So it can be a tough one to come back from if your opponent has lots of removal. And yeah, to round off the ramp, the control aspects like counterspells, I think you probably all know this, but having adequate removal is really good. Lots of ways to kill your opponent's creatures, Infernal Grasp, Power Word Kill, but just like counterspells, you don't want too much, because if you're only killing their creatures, you're not progressing your field. You have to keep progressing your field to win the game. And I think some people get blinded by the fact that they have a powerful deck by controlling and countering everything to death, but they don't actually have a way to finish the game. And yeah, that's why I'd highly recommend looking at your finishes. I just absolutely love Imrith. This is just so fantastic. Because I don't have Dragonlord Ojutai in the game yet, I just like using Imrith as a finisher. It can draw you up to 3 cards every single turn. It has Ward 4 as long as it's untapped. It's just really cool. A nice little finisher. Rarely see him. He looks awesome. I think he's definitely underrepresented, which is really sad. So you're doing all these ways, doing things to finish your opponent off. Then you want to have a few wipes, Languish, Extinction Event, Overloaded Cyclonic Rift, just ways to clear the field. Because sometimes trading 1 for 1 isn't that all effective, like a Power Word Kill for 1 creature is fine, but what if your opponent's using a Swarm deck? And if you don't equip yourself with board wipes, you're just going to be absolutely screwed. So make sure you have 3, 4, 5 board wipes, because you don't have creatures to block early. If you don't have creatures to block, you're going to be in trouble. A really spicy card for this particular build is Knight of Soul's Betrayal. If your deck doesn't have too many creatures, which this deck does not, something like this that looks like a hindrance to yourself is not. Your Toxrill is still going to be a 6/6. Yes, your slugs will automatically die if this is out, but your opponent's things will die even faster because you're already giving them -1 counters. For each slime counter, you're giving them Knight of Soul's Betrayal minus effect. So your opponent's creatures, if they're a creature deck, they're just not gonna be able to survive. So yeah, they're kind of like the key elements to a control-y Dimir build. I think pretty much covered all that. Hand disruption, very important as well to get rid of your opponent's threats, counter spells. If you're facing your opponent's counter spells, by the way, Thoughtseize, Inquisition are wonderful because you're basically trading this for a counter spell, and you get to look in their hand if this resolves. So yeah, that's definitely one way to stop counter decks. I don't see that many these days, but when you do, you just really need the Thoughtseize to take them out. If they're using a counter spell to counter your Thoughtseize, they're not using that counter spell to counter your commander. So, you know, if you play Toxrill when you have 8 mana open, it's far better because you start your turn with a Thoughtseize, see what's in the hand. If they only have 1 counter, get rid of it. Then you can resolve Toxrill, and the game's going to probably be yours. Obviously, there's a lot of factors here. If they have a kill spell in their hand after you see Thoughtseize, then still probably don't go for Toxrill. I would reserve it for later because there's no point just feeding your opponent that value. And it's a weird way to think about it because it's not, you're not giving them value as such, but that you're reducing your own value, and it kind of works out at the same level. So that's kind of like the control elements here. Let's take a look at another archetype you can build with Dimir colors. I'm going to quickly interrupt this video to tell you this video is not sponsored, and because of that, the channel does need help from people like you. So if you do want to support the channel in your own way, you can like and subscribe, which is completely free. But if you want to go the extra mile, you can donate to the channel via my Ko-fi link below, or become a channel patron. And if you become a channel patron, you can get a custom video of your choice. Check out the details below. So for this part of the video, I thought it'd be easier to actually just look at the Dimir commanders we have available to us, because once you get it into your head that mana cost kind of correlates to the speed of the deck, I think you'll find that you're just going to have an easier time understanding how tempo and speeds actually work in Magic. It took me a while to realize this. The cheaper your commander is, the more aggressive your deck's going to be. That's just how simple it is. And there's a few reasons for that. If your commander costs 2 and it dies, you'll only be paying 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 mana, right? But if your commander is like 10 mana in Dimir, maybe 10's a bit extreme, but if your commander is 6 mana, getting to 8 mana, 10 mana, 12 mana is so much harder. And for one cost of Gyruda, you can already cast your 2-drop 2, 3, 4 times by the time you get to that same amount of mana. So keep that in mind. So now we can just have a look at what are more aggressive Dimir decks, because we've just covered the slower, more control-y builds. So when I think about fast Dimir builds, I do think a lot about unblockable. I think there's a bit of mill involved. You've got the ancient one that wants to mill people. You've got Lazav that wants to mill people as well. Same with Ludovic and even Ashiok to some extent. This is a bit of an outlier because it mills your opponent and it exiles the graveyard, so it's really good, and it stops them from searching. But yeah, for the lower curve, the lower end of stuff, it's all about being super aggressive, unblockable, and stuff like that, which I've just mentioned. But the way you want to build those is you do want to reduce your curve a lot to support the deck, because if you're getting your 2 mana guy out, but there's no other support for it, you kind of have to ask yourself, why are you using a cheaper Dimir card, right? And a lot of these have some kind of evasion or graveyard mechanics. There's always like an underlying theme. These are all a bit too expensive to be considered kind of aggro, but yeah, there's not too many if you think about it for Dimir, because it is a bit more of a niche, because most people consider Dimir to be control. And I think a lot of the colours kind of want to stay in their lane for the most part, and any divergence from that just in a way breaks the colour pie. The Dimir colour pairing is all about being patient, cunning, devilishly smart, outwitting your opponent. I guess that's starting to change. If you look at a lot of the cheap ones, a lot of them are very recent, which is interesting. This Lazav is recent. Obira, the Ancient One, Venser, and Detrata. I feel like they're starting to push Dimir more into the aggressive realms, and I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, because I like the idea that the colours have their own divisions and ways that they act, but if you make every colour have fast decks, if you make every colour have slow decks, then it kind of blurs the line between why we have the colours to start with. When you're homogenizing it, it's difficult. But yeah, if you do want to build cheap, fast Dimir builds, I would highly recommend Etrata. This is just absolutely absurd. Seeing this recently, it's so powerful. You just basically get 3 creatures whenever an assassin hits your opponent. The reason this is so busted is because it's just 3 mana. It doesn't even have to be her that does the damage. She cares about other assassins. You basically manifest the top card of your opponent's deck, or they call it cloak. They call it cloak in this set because it's a slightly different to manifest because it gives the creature ward. But then you can pay 4 to turn them up into creatures as well. So that's why she's so strong. She's probably out of the ones we have here, I'd say the strongest aggro creature. I mean, you could say that Satoru Umezawa is, but by himself, he's not very good. He wants you to... So this is all about being sneaky as well, but in a different way. So he wants you to be evasive. He wants you to hit in. But then this plays differently in that it wants you to have huge creatures in your deck that you then want to cheat out. And your curve is going to look really weird. You're going to have small evasive ninjas, unblockable flying perhaps, and then huge things, might even have Toxrill. And with Satoru and Mizawa, you can get Toxrill as early as turn 3 or 4, which is just ridiculous. If you Dark Ritual into Satoru on turn 2 or something, and then have other things out, it's just going to be crazy. Or in fact, turn 1 you could go for Dark Ritual and play, I don't know, 2 Mana Rocks, Arcane Signet, and any other 2-drop one, yeah, it's possible. So this is definitely more of a combo build though, which again makes it a bit more of an outlier just because he can finish you so fast. All other cheap Dimir commanders here seem to kind of hold their pace pretty well. I would also say, if you're thinking about using Planeswalkers, be cautious because Kaito Shizuki is definitely up in the upper tiers. It's because he comes down, he protects himself by phasing out. And as I mentioned in the main deck before, his -7 is super strong. So yeah, essentially, if you're making a fast Dimir build, you want to have a lot of evasion, a lot of cards that are going to be cunning, and removal to support your early creatures to get in, just smack in. And if you're going down the mill aspect, like with the Ancient One, then things do change quite a bit because this, although this is 2 mana, it acts a lot more combo-y as well. In fact, Ancient One is unusually similar in technique to Satoru Umezawa because you want to have huge things in your deck that you can discard. Because when you mill something that's like 8 mana, or putting it into your graveyard, sorry, you'll then mill yourself equal to the mana value, and then it lets this guy attack. So it's a very unusual, interesting card. It doesn't do anything until you have 8 or more cards in your graveyard, so it can't attack or block. But once you enable it by milling, yeah, it's a very aggressive card. So it's kind of hard to judge this one. Rona again could be similar. Rona and Ancient One could belong in the same deck. They both want to put stuff into the graveyard, and then you could reanimate it later on. So, see, there's a lot of different paths here because Rona lets you just draw, discard constantly and reanimate stuff. So again, it's all to do with graveyards. They all seem to care about the graveyard in some way, or cheating big things out. It's very sneaky, and it's just pretty hard to kind of put a pin on what makes Dimir aggressive, actually, because it's not really about raw power. Dimir is more about technical skill, technical gameplay, because you're not just playing, a low curve of 1, 2, 3, 4 creatures that have equal power to their CMC, just smashing every turn. It's more about what you can do behind the scenes, and I think that's really cool flavor for Dimir. So you have to be cautious that Dimir is not a color you want to pick if you like smashing with loads of creatures early on. This is definitely more patient and similar to Izzet in some ways, but I feel like Izzet's a lot more impatient. That would be the red side. And maybe this is more similar to Azorius, where the white blue is more cautious, but I feel like white blue is even more trolly because the white blue decks of old, where they just counter everything, that would just be so toxic. I think blue black has more room to be aggressive, and I think that's better for the environment because you're not just stalling all the time. At least Dimir has these kind of early win cons that are trying to do slightly different, more unique things compared to Azorius, which is more board wipes, controls, casting to fairy, and making your opponent feel very unwelcome to the game. If we move to the mid-rangey slot, so this is more like the 4 to 5 mana slot, these are basically just, again, the thing of mid-range, hard to judge, but it's more the mid-rangey stuff where you're kind of in between control and not quite aggro because it doesn't really exist. But yeah, if you look at Rusko, for example, the reason this is just busted is because it does absolutely everything. You've probably heard countless people talk about this card, but yeah, it really does. It ramps you, it drains your opponent for 1 every time you cast non-creature spells. It's a win con in its own right. It does everything, and that's why it's just pretty unfair. It's just too much stuck onto one. But if we look at what else lies in this realm, they don't feel that threatening. It's almost like everything is kind of like a 5 out of 10 until you look at Rusko, then it's a 10 out of 10, and probably Tasha's up there in this range in terms of just abusiveness. I mean, Tasha, she doesn't do anything at all if they don't have creatures, but once she gets to -6, her ultimate wins you the game. Stealing 3 of your opponent's best creatures is so powerful especially against opposing control decks. And you probably want to build these commanders very similarly to how I described Toxful. It's a strange area to be in because in a way, the gap between 4 mana and 7 mana, the deck can be filled with pretty much the same cards. Obviously, apart from the bespoke things that want to complement the commander's abilities. But yeah, again, it's probably just going to be more of the same here. Controlling elements like kill spells, counter spells, board wipes, just to stop your opponent having anything, and then hitting critical mass with your abilities. Dimir does have some more thoughtful things though, like tallying is really wonderful. I have this in paper. It makes the game very fun because it makes it uses a new ability, which is basically a guessing game to have on a commander, choosing a number between 1 and 10, and then whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana cost or power or toughness equal to the chosen number, that player loses 2 and you draw a card. So you're just going to gain value from randomness. Now, this is probably not very competitive because in 4-player, there's going to be a lot of variance, but you could say there's going to be also a lot of people having... It's weird, right? Because it's the variance should be the downside, but the variance is also an upside. Because if you say the number 3 and your opponents are using the whole gamut, of CMC 1 to 10, then you'll only hit 1 out of 10 times. But I guess in 4-play you have more opponents, so it's interesting, but yeah, definitely more thoughtful and requires a lot more thought than people maybe give Dimir credit for. I think Dimir definitely gets a bad rap because it has a few outliers that are just absolutely abused, like Rusko, Tasha, Ashok used to be up there, and people see them and they just absolutely hate Dimir. And yeah, it's funny how a few cards can ruin the optics of a color pairing. Then you have Scarab God, it's really powerful as well. He just doesn't want to die and he just gives you value back. But yeah, as long as you use the kind of templating that I was talking about with Toxtrol, I think you'll still be able to run these using the same template. Obviously, given that you just give it a few playtests and tweak it enough. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll say Dimir is more divided in 2 than divided in 3, like Izzet was. Izzet has kind of 3 stages of deck building where you have fast, medium, and slow. But yeah, Dimir seems to be just fast and slow, I think, which is something that I didn't really think about until talking about these commanders. But yeah, hopefully that's helped to some extent in building your powerful Dimir decks. Maybe you have struggled in the past and didn't really know what direction to go in. But yeah, just you can always come back to this video, refer to the Toxtrol strategies, and apply it to your other Dimir decks. Tell me in the comments below maybe what color pairing you'd like to see next. I will eventually get through all of them, but if you have something that you definitely need help with, I'm more than happy to kind of fast track that if it's requested enough. So, until next time, watch more of my tutorials. Did you know that you can help my channel by watching another one of my videos? Go ahead, you know you want to.